Everything is streaming and we are live. So, next up on stage, Irfan Khalid, balancing between emerging tech innovations and technology adoptions. Welcome up on stage, Irfan, and a warm applause.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will close down that and you will open your presentation here. So I'll open it for you and voila.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Magnus and the team at Arabeat, for inviting me here today in beautiful Stockholm. And it's actually very interesting to talk about the subject of emerging tech in regards to innovation. And I'm happy to represent Cybercom here today. So a little bit about myself first. I originally come from Pakistan, and I did my bachelor's in computer sciences, worked in a few different IT and telco companies for a few years. I have an interest in music production and singing, so I was a part of a band. In 2010, I came to Sweden for my master's at entrepreneurship and innovation management at KTH. And just a couple of months later, I was introduced to this Swedish legend of, sweet dishes, the awesome semla. I just got hooked and I just wanted to say that. Anyways, I've worked for a few different companies, and over the period of time, I joined Cybercom in 2014. And since then, I've had different roles at Cybercom, starting from product development, product management, innovation management, and moving to the strategic side of things. I have been involved in implementation and invention of an innovation model that is used by agile teams. And I've also been the head of innovation for our Stockholm site, and since 2018, been running the innovation strategy for the group. And quite recently, I became a certified innovation leader. Here is a picture of my team, my awesome innovation leaders across the group in Poland, Finland, and Sweden. And I really believe that any challenge can be solved if provided the right nurturing. So a little about Cybercom then. Cybercom is based in the Nordics, having its offices in Sweden, Finland, Poland, Denmark, and we also have an international competence center in Mumbai. We call ourselves the makers of tomorrow. And what that means is we are really focused at helping our clients to succeed by utilizing digitalization and innovation as a tool and achieve sustainable results. When we talk about innovation, or more specifically innovation management, Cybercom sees innovation management as a means to an end rather than an end itself. What that means is by being more innovative and utilizing the different tools and processes, our goal is to help the clients to be able to achieve their business goals and also be able to contribute towards more sustainability. When you're looking at a project, you can broadly break them down into two parts or two phases. The discovery phase or the exploration phase is more about reducing uncertainty and risk. It's a different mindset. And then when we look at the delivery phase, it's about execution and efficiency and growth, a different mindset again. My fellow speakers here today will be addressing some of these aspects as well, as Adam did a little bit also. But it's always good to keep that in mind, that it can help simplify things to have the right context before going and jumping into things. So what's on the menu for today? We're going to talk about some key concepts here, different types of innovation, 3 key challenges when it comes to technology adoption in regards to emerging technologies, and then 3 tips that I will offer you. So let's talk about innovation. Innovation is defined in very different ways. And if you will Google innovation, you will have like a few million ways of describing that. So let's start with that. One definition is this. Innovation is a new or changed product, service, process, model, method, etc., realizing or redistributing value. What this means is innovation is a combination of something new, something really interesting, and then how we translate that into end users' value.
We got a question here. It's like, how certification in innovation has impacted positively in your professional endeavor?
Good question. When it comes to the certification, it's a way to professionalize the profession of innovation management. I think we were talking about, or Adam was talking about, the standards, that there are a lot of different ways of approaching the IoT, for example. And it's a similar case with innovation. But now ISO and some of our colleagues in the industry have started to gather loads of information and putting it into some best practices. And if you are aware of those practices, you have more possibility to implement better and structured innovation management systems. And that is where the certification comes in. It's a proof that to some degree you have that knowledge backed with some actual experience. So if you are somebody who is considering innovation management as a career path, so this is a good way to pursue. In Sweden, you have RISE, for example, who offer this certification, is much accepted as well and growing in numbers. So that's my quick answer to that. And going back to the definition of innovation then, innovation is not necessarily a new technology. If we reflect at this definition, it doesn't need to be technology at all. It is also not just about creativity. Creativity is important, but it's not enough to use or create something new and actually that would end and solve the customer's problem or the end user's problem. Invention is not necessarily innovation. Invention can turn into an innovation, but invention in itself is something totally new, not necessarily creating value for the end users. So there are different ways of how you describe innovation, but it's important that it should be something new and it should create value for the end user. It's an end result. Innovation is not something that you start with. Let's talk about the different types of innovation. And I'm going to talk about 4 high-level ways of describing this. Product service innovation. This could be something very simple, like how can we have an app to digitally pay for your parking tickets instead of using cash? Those of us who do this, we know how much value it creates for us. But it could be also like really new ideas and visions, like the Neuralink brain-computer interfaces. Another type is the technology itself. Technology by itself doesn't solve a problem. Technology is applied to a certain context to solve a problem. And then we have different technologies that we can choose from, like the 5G and machine learning and so on and so forth. Process And one of the very popular examples here is the Ford motors, like in 1908, when they actually implemented the assembly line for assembling their cars, they were able to reduce the time of assembling a car from 12 hours to about 1.5 hours. It's huge, but it's just changing the process. And last but not the least, business model. And business model innovation is very much about how you develop, deliver, and gain value from a customer solution. So it's a bigger process. It's not just about product. It's not about just technology or process. Here we have example from the Swedish IKEA. In order to help or raise the end value for the customer, offering a good quality furniture for its end customers, they're able to do it at a lower cost. But how do they do that? By packaging them in a way that they reduce their own costs of storage. Also, they don't assemble this, the user does it, and so on and so forth. So it's not just a process, it's actually very well connected to the end result, hence the business model innovation. There's also two key concepts I would like to talk about. It's the incremental versus radical innovation. So incremental innovations are generally referred to as something as when we do something better, or nicer or cheaper. An example of that could be the prosthetic leg. The problem is pretty much the same across past 2 centuries, but the materials, the designs, they have evolved to improve the solution. It's incremental. It's nothing like, it's not like changing the vision or anything. And it's very important to do that. But at the other side of things, other extreme, is the radical or the breakthrough innovations. And this is like completely new visions and possibilities. For example, a robotic leg. And now, this brings up totally new possibilities on how we are going to address a problem and possible solutions that previously just could not be done. What happens is the radical innovations usually take time, a longer time. But a lot of incremental innovations eventually lead to radical innovations as well. It's also a higher uncertainty when it comes to, if we think about the emerging tech. So now we are going to define emerging tech as well for the sake of this presentation. So technologies whose development, practical applications, or both are still largely unrealized. So it's still developing to much extent. And if we think about what are the trending emerging technologies this year, we hear about 5G, machine learning, robotics, blockchain, or quantum computing. But the state of emerging changes over time. So if we go back a few years, cloud computing was something very emerging. And now you could argue that it's not. It's kind of, a lot of people use it, and it's largely developed, and you can do almost anything. So over here, we are now landing into an intersection, a very interesting intersection of technology and innovation. And I would like to show you the innovation horizon model here. So what the horizon model says is that there are two parts of this, two ways of looking at it. There is a technology aspect and there is the business model. And horizon one are typically the incremental innovations. This is something that all businesses should try to do with their products and services. For example, each year we get a new iPhone with some improvements. That's incremental and very important. That's the bread and butter. But then if we move to the horizon two, we also have a bit more longer timeline. And the timeline is connected to the technology evolvement, so the uncertainty increases as well. And last but not the least, the highest degree of change lies in the Horizon 3, which is about looking a few years in the future and seeing how this particular technology can affect how we do things today entirely. It can be something totally new to the industry or totally new to the world. If we plot some of our examples earlier, can put them something like this. So you have the parking apps in Horizon 1. The technology is there, you can do that. But on the higher level, on the extreme, you also have the Neuralink brain-computer interfaces a few years in the future. But then somewhere in between, you have like the self-driving cars, and you also have a business model transfer by the money transfer solution. What is important here to realize, the emerging technologies are often enabling these radical innovations. So it is so important that we are talking about this today, because one just cannot take this lightly. In order for organizations to succeed in the future, you invest today. But how do you start with innovation then? It's quite simple in terms of when we talk about it. It's about identifying end-user pains and needs. This sounds very easy, but it's actually not in practice. When we talk about the problems or the needs, this is something that we can reflect on ourselves, as anyone can. There are issues and pains on a daily basis in our lives. For example, how to take care of plants while I'm away on my vacation for maybe a couple of weeks or a month or so. Fairly common sort of a pain. How do I break the team silos when I'm working, with my colleagues? Could be another one, or could be something really big, like how to contribute towards the climate change. So, I mean, these are all pains, or this could be something that we want to address. But most of the time, when we start to come up with ideas, we don't always think about these problems, but it's very important to reflect even afterwards. Okay, now I've come up with this awesome idea. What does it really solve? Because if it doesn't solve anything better than the other existing solutions, maybe it's not needed. So let's reflect a bit about the music industry bit here. We have on the one side the vinyl records, or the CDs or cassettes. And on the other side we have today's streaming services. Technology has changed a lot, and this has really helped evolve the music industry. On one side, when we talk about the vinyl records, you can think about why you would have wanted to move from a vinyl to a cassette. And then we can reflect on the challenge. So the challenge, I can say that, okay, it's easier for me to carry a cassette. I can use it in my car. I can take it with me. It's also easy to maintain. It's probably cheaper to buy as well. So that will help me in terms of adopting that technology, right? Eventually. Not overnight. But then you also have the CDs, right? Maybe it solves my problem of having higher quality over time. It's also fairly easy to maintain. But then if you look at the streaming services that many of us use today, they solve a different kind of challenge. Now I have my music with me all the time, and there's no limit to how much I can carry. It's always good quality. I just need a good internet. Or in some cases, you don't even need that. So it's a different challenge that it's solving. And it's really fueling the adoption. So let's now talk about the technology adoption. It's basically a sociological model that describes the adoption or acceptance of a new product or innovation according to the demographic and psychological characteristics of defined adopter groups. So we have been talking about emerging technologies so far, and when we look at the adoption, it's quite has a lot of sociological aspects to it. And of course, when we are trying to address problems, we try to solve key problems for our end users. But it doesn't mean if we solve that great problem, it's going to just happen overnight. There are a lot of different aspects that are involved. And one model that shows this a bit more graphically is the adoption curve. So the innovation adoption curve or the technology adoption curve argues that when the innovators or entrepreneurs come out with their new solutions to the market, they are received first by the early adopters. These are the people essentially who are very open to trying new things. There are also people who are quite okay with tolerating bugs. As my previous speaker, Adam, mentioned, the Ring, Amazon Ring example, first version received a lot of bad reviews, but there was a lot of reviews. So that was an indication there was some sort of a need. So this model actually argues that the early adopters, their needs are actually not the same as the early majority here. And therefore you have the chasm here. The reason is, while the early adopters are open to try new things, are okay with the bugs, that is something the early adopters do not want in most cases. They are gonna be pretty much okay with the existing solutions until a polished enough version comes for them to do their things better. And then comes the late majority. So you can actually call the chasm here as the key mindset difference. As an innovator, as an entrepreneur, you would want that your end customer to be at least adopting your solution very fast, from early adopter to early majority. You have a question?
Yes, I have a question. I'm a bit curious. I mean, has there been ways to kind of structurally understand when the chasm happens? Or to structurally, you see where I'm going here? It's like, oh, if I can understand when the chasm will happen and I can guide people through, I can get into the early majority with my invention or product.
Yeah. Very good question. And it's actually a more complex answer to it. Because we, as innovation managers, we haven't really figured out yet what's the best way to do this, but there are different models to do this. One is the sociological aspects of it, because eventually people who are the early majority, you have to really put yourself in their shoes and really see this awesome, great idea that you have been really talking about. Why should they care? If it really does something special for them, then they will adopt it faster. And I think that's what it really boils down to. But again, you need to say, you need to think about, or you can make a better kind of transition if you're really focused towards your end customers, the early majority, how you define that end customer. So if you were talking about, let's talk about Apple. They're doing a lot of fun stuff, and then they find out that there's this wireless headphone that they come up with, the AirPods. And it offers people to try them without any wires, and it works, right? And then it very fast becomes one of the most popular uh, in-ear headsets or wireless headsets. So now they have this whole mechanism to drive that and continuously learn from their users. That they have made it so that it would fit most of the people. They're not making it so that it would fit like some special part of the market. And that is one of the focus. They are very clear who they are making it for. A lot of the times, and I'm not free of this actually criticism myself, we are obsessed with ideas. We are obsessed with our own solutions. And I'm going to talk about that later. That's actually something that we can benefit from not doing if we are more problem focused. And who is it for, really? It's not easy. I hope that answers some part of that complex question. So let's move on to the. Let's go back to actually the streaming example. On the screen, we see an adoption curve of sorts from the vinyl to the streaming services. And what we see is it has taken a lot of years to do that, to start with, but then it's also clear that each technology has its own curve. It's not similar. So if we think about vinyl to cassettes, we can clearly see that cassettes were able to generate higher revenues than for the industry than ever before. Then came in the compact disc. But then there's a huge drop. And very recently, like 3 years ago now, we're starting to see, a rising curve there again with the streaming services. And one of the reasons that we're also going to talk about later is an unintended consequence. With the digital content, CDs, also comes piracy. And that's a bigger, I'm sure that's not really something that was envisioned at that time. But now it's here, and you have to, there's no way going back now. So it took a while, and now we are finally going back with the new business model and way to make it easier for everyone. And the infrastructure has built over time with the 3G, 4G, 5G, and so on. So, with that said, if you are an entrepreneur or an innovator and really fascinated by emerging technologies, here are 3 key challenges you should have in your mind. First of all, the price of admission. And this is the price your end user needs to pay in order to try and also gain the value from the solution that you've made. The price can be in terms of hardware or software, but it could also be in terms of changing habits, for example. Let's talk about this virtual continuum. On one extreme, you have reality. The other side is the virtual reality and everything in between. So, if there's a cool new solution that we come up with that requires the end user to try it via augmented reality, what's the price of admission? The minimal price of admission would be something, some sort of actual investment, financial. A few years ago, there was only these HoloLens and those, but now we also have some features on the mobile phones. So it's getting easier. Then we have a different cost for each and every type of category. And the thing is, maybe we have come up with the best solution ever to solve the problem, when we talk about the adoption, the end user needs to, in some way, get access to this stuff, right? And that is what you call the price of admission. And without having access to this stuff, they can't even test your best new solution, right? So you can expect it's going to take a while before they have access to that. Or maybe you can come up with ideas to make it easy for them to have access to it, if that's the best solution. And once they have the access, then let's move to the next challenge, interaction. What kind of interaction the end user is expected in order to gain value from the solution? So essentially, there are two types of interactions. One is the direct, the other is indirect. And when we talk about the direct, you can think about maybe the VR headset. In order to immerse the user in that experience, the user really needs to interact with that environment in some way. And with the virtual, if you're playing a game on VR, for those who have tried it, we know it's a lot of fun. You need that interaction. You need to learn how to navigate that in that virtual environment. So there is a mental cost over there. There's a learning curve as well. And if that's the best solution to solve a particular need, that's great. But this is just important to know that the user is expected to interact. On the other end, or the other extreme, is the indirect. And in this case, you can think about the end user does not even need to know if the technology is there or if the solution is there. It's just providing value to them. Example can be a camera powered by computer vision and some machine learning algorithms constantly evaluating the well-being of different type of fish, or counting the number of pigs in China, for example, in a farm. In essence, the end user, the technology is actually invisible for them. So the interaction is not required, really. And in terms of the end user's mental cost, it's none, almost to none. So the important thing is the goal should be to put your end user at the center of it all. Try to understand what is the minimal amount of energies your end user need to spend in order to gain benefit from your solution, and base your decision upon that as well. I would also say, like, as soon as innovations work well, you forget about them actually, because then they are solving your problems, and they should do that. You don't need to worry about the innovation itself. And third, challenge that I'm going to talk about is the unintended consequences of things. And this is a bit more tricky. So, over the past centuries or decades, societies have developed new solutions, new products, services to address their problems. And with those new solutions and new way of working, they have challenged the humanity and the society, forcing them to reflect and also to change. When we talk about emerging technologies, since they have too much potential, but it's also unknown how much potential that could be, it becomes even more relevant. And Joseph Schumpeter, uh, widely regarded as the father of entrepreneurship, used the term creative destruction for this. You create something new and you destroy something old, but eventually it gets accepted over time, and it changes the society. So, when we look into these societal aspects, so ethics can be one important aspect there. Let's talk about the deepfakes. Very interesting technology, but who would have thought that it could be used to scam people or send false information if you use it to, use it really well. You can actually fool a lot of people, and the technology is developing really fast. It's scary. It scares us today. Google Clips, a product fairly simple in terms of what it was trying to achieve. You put it somewhere, and it will analyze the environment and take the nicest pictures for you. Sounds very, very nice, and then came up the issue of the camera is looking at me the whole time. People don't like that. I'm pretty sure Google, that was not really the intention when Google made this, but it created a new concern. The product is discontinued as we speak now. Then you can also talk about the law. You have the self-driving cars, and we know it works to a fairly good level today. Not perfect, absolutely not. But in the worst case scenario, if something goes wrong, who owns the responsibility? And there is that important part to think about. So the message here is the bigger picture is not always clear, and even more so when we talk about the emerging technologies. You can think about it, it's important to think about it, and not be super focused on just that exact problem. It's also important to have the bigger picture in mind, but then you can bet that it's things will come up that you cannot anticipate today. So, we've talked about a few problems. Let's talk about a few tips as well. So, I'm going to talk about 3 tips. And first of them is being the problem-driven mindset. Somebody asked this question early. And problem-driven instead of solution-driven is very important. The reason is, based on research by CB Insights here, you see top reasons why different startups fail to succeed. And you know what's the number one problem here? What's the number one issue why startups fail? There's just no market need. Or the need is so small that it doesn't cover your cost. And interestingly, there are ways to fix this cheaply, if only if we are problem-driven and not solution-driven. What I mean to say here is, think of innovation as a very non-linear process, right? So you want to think in 2 perspectives. While you're testing your ideas and problems, you want to identify that you want to do the right things first. And once you have fairly good level of confidence in your concept, then you go and take it to the market, and that's doing things right. So, for example, here you have the best idea to solve world's hunger problem, and you say that this is awesome. So what problem focus means is that you have to think about who is hungry really, and that's your end user. How do you bring that value to that user base? You want to get early feedback. I think that this will be something that we will, or one of the speakers will probably talk about later today. But the end users, for them, is very important to know, to see. Seeing is believing, right? So if you have never been hungry in the past few months, that means it's not your problem you're solving, it's somebody else's problem. But it's still a problem, right? So what you need to do is you need to think about how can I test my assumptions cheaply? Try to put yourself in that end user's shoes. Try to empathize with them. Come up with ideas, maybe use paper prototypes. As simple as using paper and pen. It's fine. It's very cheap and very effective. You also can do very cheap prototypes without any real functionality. But you do want to get the input from this guy here, whose problem you're trying to solve. And you know what? Once you show your idea to this guy, in many cases, they will tell you, now that I see it, I don't want it. But it could be something else. Maybe you need to change, you need to adapt, and you need to go back to your prototyping or even the idea stage. And that is the process that you really want to focus on when it comes to problem-driven. Maybe you might end up deciding that it's just not a good time to pursue this problem. Or the solution you end up with is not based on emerging technology. That's okay. The second tip I want to give you is the execution. So now we have talked about this idea, and now we want to do something. We want to solve a great problem. A lot of the times we lose ourselves in the ideas. Ideas, in essence, are cheap. What matters more than a great idea is a great execution. Think of this like if Elon Musk comes to you and tells you, here are my top 5 ideas. Choose whatever you want and do it. So if you are not able to execute that in a good way, it doesn't matter. So a well-executed weak idea has higher potential translating into end users adoption than a poorly executed great idea. So here we quote Peter Drucker, ideas are cheap and abundant. What is of value is the effective placement of those ideas into situations that develop into actions. And last but not the least, failure and patience. Eventually, as innovators and entrepreneurs, it is written in our fate to fail at one point or another. That is not a bad thing if you think about it. The more important question is, can you embrace failure and adapt to that quickly? That is what you need to focus on. So, think big, start small, learn fast. Embrace failures, they're actually really helpful. We are, as innovation management professionals, always trying to find faster ways of failing so that we can adapt faster. And with that, I would like to leave you with Paul Sappho's quote here. Never mistake a clear view for a short distance. And while emerging technologies are so important, they're so important when it comes to radical innovations, they're so important in terms of coming up with new potential solutions to solve bigger problems that previously we could not. It also brings some risks that are greater in terms of, because a lot of things are uncertain. And if you are able to take some of the learnings from this talk, it will help you in your innovative journey and solve actual problems. All right, that's all the time that I have today, but I would like to thank Arabit and Magnus for inviting me here today. Are there any questions?
No, but I have actually one question. Or two questions. First question is, you talked about 4 different, like you could innovate in technology, process, I don't remember the method.
Business model.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Where is the most disruption happening right now? In which of these 4 dimensions?
So, based on research, if you are thinking about what leads to most value, so that is the business model. A lot of times we as, or I'm talking about myself, being somebody who works with tech, I'm obsessed with the product and services. But in reality, business model is where that delivers most value.
Okay, so is there any specific region in the world right now where like business model is, like where's the disruption happening? Is it California, is it Stockholm, or is it Asia somewhere? We don't even know, they're inventing new business models and we don't understand they're going to take over the world.
Yeah, so of course, you have the Silicon Valley and those places where it's really alive, and they are also very resilient to change because they have super high competition there. But when we talk about developed markets or developed places like Europe and Sweden, it's even more important here because a lot of the issues that are faced in other less developed or developing countries are not here. So you need to play with different angles of it. A few years ago, it was about changing from the product and service business model to more service-oriented, like the streaming services. And now we are talking a lot about circular business models in terms of making the planet more sustainable, for example. And all of this is very much closely connected to the business model innovation.
Yeah, and then I have one more thought question around innovation. I mean, if you look at least this is my, unempirical observation, is that things kind of converge. If you look at phones today, they are like, and cars, doesn't matter what car brand you buy, more or less, they look the same. I mean, do you see it converged when you look at stuff? You have like you said, early adopters, late adopters, and then at some point, is it always an end game, like winner takes it all, or 2-3 solution companies takes over and takes it all, or?
So what we have learned over time is not one company is capable of innovating all by itself and all by its own. You have examples like Apple, one of the biggest names, and they source a lot of materials from Samsung, who are their direct competitors. It's just the ecosystem view of things that you need to find your niche, or you also have to find your specialization, and you have to see everything else as possible partnerships. And that is important because previously we used to have the closed innovation ecosystems. A company would like to have this R&D center, they're responsible for everything. Over time we have learned it's less effective than the open innovation ecosystems. And if you talk about this, technologies, typically companies try to, there's a popular model, 70-20-10, that 70% on incremental, then Horizon 2 and Horizon 3. And all companies need to think about all of these if they want to succeed in the future, in the long term. And many of the learnings, when you start looking into them, you start understanding that, okay, the AI technology is probably interesting in 2 years, but the brain-computer interfaces will come like after that, and you will eventually start converging into some of the solutions that you come out with. But the thing is, who does it better than the other takes the bigger, share. But it's of course a complex problem. It's not just about innovating in itself. It's also about marketing and budgeting and having that culture. And I think structured way of approaching this problem.
Is there any more questions here? No? I have one final question then.
Yes.
Because if you look at it's interesting. So we start talking about ecosystems, and do you have you at Cybercom or anywhere else started to how can we make this? How can we get people with innovations come into companies? I don't know, bigger companies maybe, to give them a fair share of stuff, but also to be able, because the big company can supply other things. I mean, they can try out in a larger scale. I mean, have you looked at business models for that, or is that kind of somewhere to innovate?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, I think that is where we are heading. It's also quite relevant with the discussion of the introduction of ISO's innovation management standards, because now more people are reading them, and within that they really focus on how to build an innovation management ecosystem, basically a systems approach. That innovation is not something that you do at a specific time. It's not something that you do in a silo. It has to contribute towards the bigger goal of any organization. And then there are different parts that you can choose to focus on. It's like the culture aspects. There's also the execution. It's also the patents. It's also the discovery parts. So it's so many different aspects. You don't get to do all of them simultaneously. So if you say that for us as a Cybercom, as a company, what's important is for us to help our clients be more competitive in their digital world. So that's our edge, and we want to be our clients' partners, right? But if there's a company or a product service company, they would want to have those partners in their ecosystem so they can find that competitive edge. Specialization is very important in this case. Now, I don't like to talk about innovation as, okay, now we're going to innovate. It's many companies, many good companies today don't even talk about innovation. They talk about problem solving, and that's what it is. It's just how you approach that with different methods and gain a competitive edge at the end of the day.
Yes, thank you very much, Irfan.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Yes, big applause for Irfan. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for coming. And we will take a 10-minute break, and then we will be back with Anders. Yes, thanks.